Did you know a medieval queen's marriage contract could force her to marry her husband's successor if he died? Or that a 6-year-old princess came with a dowry of 800,000 gold francs, enough to stop a war for a week. And get this, some marriage contracts, even for non-royals from over 900 years ago, listed every single tunic, veil, and even perfume burner the bride brought with her, plus exactly what her husband owed her if they split. Forget vague promises. These medieval folks spelled it all out, and their marriage contracts reveal some truly wild secrets about love, power, and money back in the day. Number 6. The It Couple, whose prenuptial raid defined a kingdom. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Okay, picture this. It's the mid-1400s in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula is a patchwork of kingdoms, and two of the biggest players are Castile and Aragon. Isabella was the heir presumptive to Castile, and Ferdinand was the heir to Aragon. Their marriage in 1469 wasn't just a personal union. It was a political earthquake that would eventually lead to a unified Spain. But Isabella was no pushover, and their agreements both before and after tying the knot laid down some serious ground rules. Before they even said, "I do," they hammered out the agreement of Cervera. This was super important because Isabella was marrying a foreign prince, and the Castilian nobles were wary of Aragonese influence. The agreement made it clear that Ferdinand would live in Castile and respect its laws and customs. He was to be king consort, but Isabella would retain her sovereign rights. Think of it as her setting the terms from day one. Then, after they were married and Isabella had become Queen of Castile in 1474, they issued something called the Concord of Segovia in 1475. This document is where things get really juicy and reveal the secret to their surprisingly, for the time, balanced power dynamic. It wasn't technically a marriage contract in the traditional sense of dowry and dower, but it was a direct consequence of their marriage and defined how they would rule together. So, what did it say? First off, official documents, like royal decrees and charters, were to be issued in both their names. Isabella's name usually came first, acknowledging her primary claim to Castile. Coins minted in Castile would also bear both their images and names. This was a huge visual statement of joint rule. When it came to power, the Concord was specific. Ferdinand was granted the title of King of Castile, alongside Isabella as Queen. He could exercise royal authority, dispense justice, and make appointments, but, and this is a big but, he had to do so in accordance with Castilian law and generally with Isabella's consent. Especially on major issues, he couldn't just make unilateral decisions affecting her kingdom. Here's a key clause. Ferdinand was not allowed to sell off or give away any Castilian royal lands or castles without Isabella's explicit permission. This protected Castile's assets and ensured Isabella maintained control over her inheritance. He also couldn't declare war or make peace without her agreement. Imagine that, a queen ensuring her husband consulted her on matters of state, formally written down. The administration of justice was to be carried out jointly when they were together, and separately when they were in different parts of the kingdom, but always upholding Castilian law. Appointments to important government and church positions in Castile also required Isabella's ultimate approval, even if Ferdinand proposed candidates. What about their kids? The Concord affirmed that their eldest son or daughter, if there was no son, would inherit Castile. This was standard. But placing it within this power-sharing agreement underscored the dynastic importance of their union. The secret here isn't some hidden scandal, but the remarkably forward-thinking, for the 15th century way, Isabella secured her own authority and established a framework for joint rule with her husband. While Ferdinand gained considerable power in Castile through the marriage, the terms ensured he was a partner, not an overlord. This wasn't a case of a queen's lands being absorbed by her husband's. It was a carefully negotiated co-rulership that respected Isabella's primary rights as Queen of Castile. Their personal motto, Tanto monta monta tanto Isabel como Fernando, roughly meaning, the one is as good as the other. Isabella, like Ferdinand, reflected this unique partnership, all rooted in the agreements that structured their incredibly influential marriage. It was a power-sharing deal that shaped the future of Spain. Number 5. The child bride whose dowry was meant to buy peace. Isabella of Valois and Richard II of England. Get ready for a story that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but it was deadly serious politics in the late 14th century. We're talking about King Richard II of England and Isabella of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI of France. Their marriage contract, sealed within the Treaty of Paris in 1396, is a mind-bender, mostly because Isabella was just 6 years old at the time of the agreement. Yes, 6. The backdrop was the 100 Years' War, that long, brutal slog between England and France. By the 1390s, both sides were exhausted and looking for a breather. Richard II, who had his own troubles with powerful nobles at home, was keen on peace with France. Charles VI of France was also inclined towards peace, partly due to his own recurring bouts of mental illness. A royal marriage was the classic medieval way to seal a peace treaty. So what were the terms of this extraordinary marriage contract for a literal child bride? The most headline-grabbing part was Isabella's dowry. The French agreed to pay a staggering 800,000 gold francs. To put this into perspective, this was an absolutely colossal sum, a king's ransom several times over. It was to be paid in installments. The first 300,000 francs were due when Isabella was handed over to the English. This wasn't just about providing for the young queen. It was a massive financial transfer that essentially helped fund the English crown and showed France's commitment to the deal. In return for this queen and her mountain of gold, a 28-year truce was declared between England and France. This was the real prize for both kings. A long period of peace, which they desperately needed. The marriage was the pretty ribbon on this very political package. Because Isabella was so young, she was formally married at Calais in October 1396, still aged 6, to the 29-year-old Richard II. The contract had some very specific and unusual clauses regarding her situation. Crucially, the marriage was not to be consummated until Isabella reached the age of 12. This was a standard canon law provision for child marriages, acknowledging she was too young for marital relations. What if Richard died before the marriage could be consummated, or before Isabella reached an age where she could consent and have children? The contract stipulated that if Richard died before Isabella turned 12, 400,000 francs of her dowry, the portion already paid, should be returned to France, and Isabella herself would be returned to her home country free to marry elsewhere. This was a kind of insurance policy for the French, ensuring they wouldn't lose both their princess and a huge chunk of money if the political alliance collapsed prematurely due to Richard's death. Isabella, despite her age, was to be treated as Queen of England. She brought a small French household with her, though efforts were made to ensure she was surrounded by English attendants to help her assimilate. The idea was that she would grow up in England, learn the language and customs, and be ready to be a fully active queen when she came of age. The secret of this contract lies not just in the shocking youth of the bride, but in how it starkly reveals the way children, especially royal daughters, were used as political pawns. Isabella's personal feelings or well-being were secondary to the strategic needs of two kingdoms. The detailed financial arrangements, including the repayment clauses, show that this was as much a business transaction and a diplomatic maneuver as it was a marriage. The immense dowry was essentially France paying for peace with Isabella as the guarantee. Sadly, the peace didn't last forever, and Isabella's story took a tragic turn. Richard II was overthrown and likely murdered in 1399-1400 by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Isabella was only 10. The new king, Henry IV, kept her in England for a while, hoping to perhaps marry her to his own son, the future Henry V, to maintain the French connection and keep the dowry. However, the French demanded her return, and eventually, after much negotiation and the repayment of a portion of the dowry, she went back to France. She later married Charles, Duke of Orleans, but died in childbirth at the young age of 19. Her childhood marriage contract stands as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of medieval dynastic politics. Number 4. The Egyptian Jewish bride who spelled it all out. A Cairo Geniza Ketubah. Let's step away from the glittering crowns of Europe and into the bustling world of medieval Fustat, Old Cairo, Egypt. Here, within the Jewish community, marriage wasn't just a sacred union. It was also a carefully documented legal agreement called a ketubah. Thanks to the incredible treasure trove of documents found in the Cairo Geniza, a storeroom in the Ben Ezra synagogue, we have actual surviving ketubat, plural of ketubah, from over 1,000 years ago. These aren't about forging alliances between nations, but they reveal fascinating secrets about personal commitments, women's rights, and the value of possessions in everyday, though often prosperous, medieval life. Let's look at a typical yet incredibly detailed example. Imagine a ketubah from, say, the 11th or 12th century. They followed a fairly standard pattern, but with personalized details. One such document, the ketubah of Elazar ben Yitzhak and Miriam bat Nissim from Fustat, dated 1028, gives us a fantastic window. First, the ketubah would identify the bride and groom, their father's names, and the date and place of the marriage. It would then state the groom's declaration to the bride in Aramaic, which was the traditional language for these legal documents. He would essentially say, "Be my wife according to the law of Moses and Israel." Then came the really interesting parts: the financial obligations and the bride's contributions. The groom would pledge a certain sum of money to the bride. This had two components: the mohar, a basic sum prescribed by rabbinic law that was due to the wife, and an additional amount the groom voluntarily added, known as the nedunia, or additional jointure. This total sum was the amount the wife would receive from her husband's estate if he divorced her or if he died before her. It was a crucial financial protection for the woman. For Miriam, Alazar pledged a substantial sum. Next, and this is where it gets incredibly detailed, the ketubah would often list the bride's dowry, the property she brought into the marriage. This wasn't just a vague goods and chattels. Oh, no. These lists could be astonishingly specific. For Miriam Bat Nissim, her trousseau was meticulously itemized. Each item, or group of items, would often have an assessed monetary value next to it. The total value of the dowry she brought was then recorded. The husband in the ketubah acknowledged receipt of this dowry and often undertook to be responsible for it, meaning if it was lost or damaged through his fault, he'd have to replace it or its value. But it wasn't just about what she brought. The ketubah also outlined the husband's obligations during the marriage. He was legally bound to provide his wife with food, clothing, and shelter according to the standards of the community and his means. He was also obligated to provide for her medical care if she fell ill, and to ransom her if she were taken captive, a real danger at times. And importantly, the ketubah affirmed his obligation to cohabit with her and fulfill her conjugal rights. The secret of these Geniza ketubot is twofold. First, they demonstrate a remarkable level of legal protection and financial security afforded to Jewish women in this period within the framework of their own community's laws. The ketubah wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a legally binding contract that a wife could take to the Jewish court, the Beth Din, to enforce her rights. Second, the incredibly detailed lists of possessions offer an unparalleled glimpse into the material culture of the time. We learn what people owned, what they valued, the types of fabrics they wore, and the household items they considered essential. These aren't grand political treaties, but they are profoundly personal documents that bring the medieval world to life in a very tangible way, showing us that even 1,000 years ago people understood the importance of spelling things out, especially when it came to marriage and money. Miriam Bat Nissim knew exactly what she was bringing to her marriage, and exactly what she was entitled to. Number 3. The Queen, who was forced to marry her conqueror. Twice. Anne of Brittany. This story is pure medieval drama, involving a fiercely independent duchy, a determined young duchess, and the relentless ambitions of the French crown. Anne of Brittany, who became duchess in her own right at the tender age of 11, found her marriage contracts becoming the literal instruments of her beloved Brittany's absorption into France. Brittany, in the late 15th century, was a proud and largely autonomous region, jealously guarding its unique customs and political independence from its powerful neighbor France. Anne, as its last independent ruler from the old ducal house, was the key to its future. Her marriage was not just a personal matter, it was the linchpin of Breton sovereignty. The pressure was immense. After a series of political and military defeats for Brittany, the French king, Charles VIII, saw his chance. In 1491, Anne, then just 14, was compelled to marry him. Their marriage contract, signed at Langres, was less a romantic agreement and more a political surrender with some very specific and harsh terms for Anne and Brittany. Anne and Charles VIII had several children, but tragically, none survived infancy. When Charles VIII died suddenly in 1498, from an accident, he hit his head on a lintel, Anne was a widow at 21. According to that bombshell clause, she was now supposed to marry the new king, Louis XII. Now Louis XII had a problem. He was already married to Jeanne of France. But Louis was determined. He wanted Brittany, and Anne was the key. He swiftly sought an annulment from Jean, on rather dubious grounds, which he obtained. Anne and Louis XII had 2 daughters who survived, Claude and Renée. Claude of France eventually married Francis of Angoulême, who became King Francis I of France. Through Claude, Brittany's union with France was further cemented, and in 1532 the Duchy of Brittany was formally incorporated into the Kingdom of France. The secret locked within Anne of Brittany's marriage contracts is the stark illustration of how personal destinies, especially those of women in power, were ruthlessly subordinated to the cold, hard logic of state building. Her first contract, with its shocking remarriage clause, shows the lengths to which the French monarchy would go to absorb the last great independent fiefdom. Even her second, slightly more favorable contract ultimately couldn't prevent the inevitable. Anne fought to preserve Breton autonomy as best she could through these agreements, but the sheer power of the French crown, wielded through the legal force of marriage contracts, proved overwhelming. She was, quite literally, married into submission, twice. Number 2. The fiery Duchess whose lands sparked a century of war, Eleanor of Aquitane and Louis VII of France. Eleanor of Aquitane. The name alone conjures images of power, rebellion, and one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages. When she married Louis VII of France in 1137, she wasn't just any bride. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine and Poitou, in her own right ruler of a vast territory in southwestern France that was larger and richer than the French king's own domain. Their marriage contract, or at least the well-understood terms of their union, held the secret to a massive shift in European power, eventually leading to immense conflict. Eleanor was about 15, and Louis, the heir to the French throne, was about 17. Her father, William X, Duke of Aquitaine, had died suddenly, leaving Eleanor as his sole heir to these sprawling, wealthy lands. On his deathbed, he expressed his wish for her to marry Louis, perhaps hoping to secure protection for his daughter and his duchy by linking it to the French crown. The exact, original written marriage contract document from 1137 is a bit elusive for historians to point to in its complete, signed and sealed form today, unlike some later meticulously preserved treaties. However, the fundamental terms of the union, especially concerning the governance and inheritance of Aquitaine, were clearly established and understood, forming the basis of their marriage. Eleanor and Louis VII were married for 15 years. They went on the Second Crusade together, a famously disastrous expedition where their incompatibility became very apparent. They had 2 daughters, Marie and Alix, but crucially, no sons. The lack of a male heir became a massive issue. Louis VII desperately needed a son to secure his own Capetian dynasty on the French throne. Eleanor, for her part, reportedly found Louis too pious and monk-like for her tastes. Tensions grew, fueled by political disagreements and personal estrangement. By 1152, the marriage was on the rocks. They obtained an annulment, officially on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related, a common pretext for dissolving politically inconvenient marriages. The church agreed, and their marriage was declared void. And here's where the terms of their original marriage agreement kicked in with dramatic effect. Since there was no male heir from their union to inherit both France and Aquitaine, the vast lands of Aquitaine and Poitou reverted fully to Eleanor. She was once again the independent duchess, one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers in Europe, and now suddenly the most eligible bachelorette. She didn't stay single for long. Just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis VII, Eleanor made a stunning move. She married Henry Plantagenet, then Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who was 11 years her junior. 2 years later, in 1154, Henry became king, Henry II of England. Suddenly, through this new marriage, the Duchess of Aquitaine was now also Queen of England. Her vast French territories, Aquitaine, Poitou, Gascony, were added to Henry's existing domains, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and soon England. This created a massive block of territories, often called the Enjan Empire, which stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees. The King of England was now also the ruler of more French land than the King of France himself. The secret of Eleanor and Louis VII's marriage arrangement, specifically the clause about Aquitaine's inheritance, combined with their failure to produce a male heir and subsequent annulment, directly led to this monumental shift in the political map of Europe. Louis VII had hoped to absorb Aquitaine into France. Instead, he saw it delivered into the hands of his greatest rival. This control of vast French territories by the English crown became a major source of conflict and a primary cause of the intermittent warfare between England and France that would simmer and explode over the next 3 centuries, including the 100 Years' War. It all went back to a marriage contract, a lack of a son, and a duchess who knew her rights. Number 1. The Scottish treaty bride, whose descendant took England's throne, Margaret Tudor and James IV of Scotland. This marriage contract is a tale of roses, thistles, and a long-term political gamble that paid off spectacularly, though not for generations. We're talking about Margaret Tudor, daughter of King Henry VII of England and King James IV of Scotland. Their marriage in 1503 was enshrined in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, and boy did that title turn out to be optimistic in the short term. But the dynastic secret tucked within its clauses would change the course of British history. The late 15th and early 16th centuries saw England and Scotland as frequently warring neighbors. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, was a shrewd diplomat. He wanted to secure his dynasty, establish peace on his northern border, and perhaps, just perhaps, gain some influence over Scotland. Marrying his eldest daughter Margaret to the maidament Scottish king seemed like a good way to do it. James IV, for his part, was also open to a prestigious alliance that might bring stability. The negotiations were complex, resulting in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, signed in 1502, with the marriage itself taking place in Edinburgh in August 1503. Margaret was just 13. James IV was 30. So, what happened? The Perpetual Peace didn't last very long. Despite the marriage, old enmities and shifting European alliances proved stronger. In 1513, just 10 years after the wedding, James IV, honoring his alliance with France, the Old Alliance, invaded England, while Henry VIII, Margaret's brother, was campaigning in France. James IV was killed at the disastrous Battle of Flodden, leaving Margaret, a young widow with an infant son, James V. Margaret's life remained tumultuous. She served as regent for her son remarried and played a complex role in Scottish politics, sometimes favoring English interests, sometimes Scottish. But the real secret of her marriage contract bore fruit much later. Margaret Tudor and James IV's son was James V of Scotland. James V's daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots. and Mary, Queen of Scots' son, was James VI of Scotland. Meanwhile, in England, Margaret's brother, Henry VIII, famously had 6 wives, but only one sickly son, Edward VI, who died young. His daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, both reigned, but died childless. When Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, died in 1603 without an heir, the English crown passed to her closest collateral relative with the strongest claim, James VI of Scotland. He was the great-grandson of Margaret Tudor and James IV. Thus, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in a personal union. The full political union would come later with the Act of Union in 1707. This momentous event, the union of the crowns, was a direct, if delayed, consequence of the dynastic link forged by the marriage contract of Margaret Tudor and James IV a century earlier. That carefully negotiated dowry, the specified jointure, lands like Stirling Castle, and the political hope for peace, all wrapped up in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, ultimately led to a Scottish king sitting on the English throne, reshaping the British Isles forever. The secret wasn't hidden in a dark clause, but in the simple biological fact of lineage that royal marriage contracts were always designed to influence.